Judge Edward Greenlee, a gray-haired man with a stern face and glasses perched at the tip of his nose, sat behind the bench. He was 68, and in his 30 years on the bench, he had seen it all, from petty thefts to complex corporate lawsuits. Today's case seemed routine, a public disturbance. The defendant, Jasmine Crockett, a 45-year-old congresswoman, Greenlee only knew from news headlines. Her name often appeared in political debates, usually associated with fiery speeches about social justice. Another loud activist, he thought, flipping through the paperwork. But when Jasmine entered the courtroom, something about her presence made him pause. She was dressed modestly but with dignity, a dark navy blazer, a white blouse, neatly styled hair. Her steps were confident but not defiant, and her eyes held a calm fire that was hard to ignore. Greenlee cleared his throat and banged his gavel. Case number 25-0418, State of Texas versus Jasmine Crockett. You are charged with disturbing the peace during a protest on March 15th. How do you plead? His voice was dry as the Texas wind. Jasmine lifted her chin, her voice clear with a slight southern accent. Not guilty, Your Honor. Greenlee sighed. He'd heard that hundreds of times. The prosecutor, a young man in a too-tight suit named Trevor Baines, stood up and began laying out the case. On March 15th, the defendant participated in an unauthorized rally outside Dallas City Hall. According to police reports, she refused to disperse after multiple warnings and encouraged others to disobey. We're requesting a $500 fine and 40 hours of community service. The judge looked at Jasmine. Ms. Crockett, do you have anything to say in your defense? She nodded, stepped forward, and spoke, not rushed, but with such force that even the reporters stopped whispering. Your Honor, I don't deny I was there. But I didn't disturb the peace. I was trying to restore it. That protest arose because of the closure of the only community center in East Dallas, a neighborhood mostly made up of elderly residents and low-income families. People lost a place where they could receive free legal aid, medical care, and a safe space for their children after school. I wasn't there to shout. I was there to listen and to remind the authorities that their decisions have consequences. Greenlee frowned. He had heard about the center's closure. It had been in the news a few weeks earlier. But the law is the law. That doesn't excuse disturbing the peace, Ms. Crockett. Police say you ignored an order to disperse. Jasmine held his gaze. I respect the law, Your Honor. But when an order contradicts justice, don't we have the right to ask questions? I didn't shout or shove. I asked the officers why they were protecting a decision that harms the community instead of protecting the people who had gathered. They didn't answer. Instead, they arrested me. Prosecutor Baines scoffed. Your Honor, this is just an excuse. The law doesn't include asking questions as an exemption. Greenlee tapped his fingers on the bench. He didn't like politicians in his courtroom. They always tried to turn it into a stage. But Jasmine's voice held no theatrics, only conviction. He glanced at the police report. Defendant stood before the crowd, spoke with officers, refused to step back. No mention of aggression. That intrigued him. You say you didn't incite unrest? He asked. No, Your Honor. I asked people to remain peaceful. I said, if we want change, we have to show who we are, not through shouting, but through action. I was trying to de-escalate when the police began pushing forward. Greenlee leaned back in his chair. The room fell silent, the only sound the hum of the fans. He knew he could just issue the fine and be done. But something in her words struck him. Maybe it was the mention of elderly residents, like his own sister who lived in a similar neighborhood and often complained about lack of support. Ms. Crockett, do you understand that I could fine you right now? He said, testing her reaction. She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. But I believe the courtroom is a place where truth matters more than quick judgments. I'm prepared to accept the consequences if you believe I'm wrong. But first, allow me to ask, is the law always right when it ignores those who have no voice? Those words hit Greenlee harder than he expected. He ran a hand through his silver hair, feeling the old courtroom almost come alive around him. Reporters scribbled furiously. An elderly woman in a floral dress nodded approvingly. Prosecutor Baines looked irritated but stayed silent. "I will issue a ruling," Greenlee declared, his voice sharper. "A $250 fine for disobeying police orders. Case closed." He banged the gavel, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Jasmine Crockett didn't look defeated. She thanked him with the same calm confidence and walked out. And Greenlee remained seated, staring at the empty spot where she had stood, feeling like he had just lost a battle he hadn't even known he was fighting. The next day, the phone rang in the judge's office. His assistant Mary, a sharp-tongued 62-year-old with a love for strong coffee, entered with a folder in hand. "Edward, you'll want to see this," she said, laying the papers on his desk. Reporters dug up that Jasmine Crockett isn't just a congresswoman. She graduated law school with honors, worked as a civil rights attorney before going into politics. That woman knows the law better than half the prosecutors in this district. Greenlee raised his eyebrows, a mix of surprise and irritation bubbling in his chest. "Why didn't she say that yesterday?" Mary smiled. Maybe she didn't want to brag. "But listen, that's not all. She filed an appeal against your fine. And not just a formal one, it's a 20-page masterpiece, with precedent cases I haven't seen since law school. She claims her First Amendment rights were violated and cites Texas versus Johnson, 1989. Edward, she might win." The judge took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He pictured her voice in the courtroom, calm, but sharp as a knife through butter. And now he understood. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just an activist. She was a player who knew the rules better than he did. "What am I supposed to do with this, Mary?" he muttered. "What can you do?" she replied with a shrug. "She's already one step ahead. And you know what? I don't think she'll stop until she proves she's right." Outside, Dallas buzzed with life. The hum of cars on the freeway, a distant dog barking, the smell of hot asphalt creeping in through the window frame. Greenlee leaned back in his chair, the appeal in his hands. He knew a storm was coming, and that Jasmine Crockett wasn't the kind to back down. Dallas hummed along in its usual rhythm, but in Judge Greenlee's office, a tense silence reigned. Sunlight slipped through the blinds, casting stripes across worn wooden shelves cluttered with volumes of legal codes. The scent of old paper mingled with the aroma of fresh coffee that Mary had just placed on the table. Greenlee sat holding Jasmine Crockett's appeal in his hands, his throat dry. 20 pages, dense, impeccably structured text, with references to precedents he barely remembered from law school. This wasn't just a request to reconsider a fine. It was a challenge. "She's citing Texas versus Johnson," he muttered, flipping through the pages. "And Cox versus Louisiana. Is she trying to turn this minor case into a First Amendment battle?" Mary, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, said, "And you thought she'd just pay the fine and walk away? Edward, this woman's no rookie. She knows how to play this game." Greenlee tossed the papers onto the table and rubbed his temples. He was 68 and proud of his reputation as a fair but firm judge. But now he felt like Jasmine Crockett had backed him into a corner. He imagined the headlines in the local papers. "Congresswoman challenges Judge Greenlee. Will he reconsider his ruling?" For someone who grew up in an era where respect for the judiciary was untouchable, it felt like a slap in the face. "All right," he said, standing up. "Let's see what she's up to. Tell Baines to prepare for the appeal hearing. I won't let her turn my courtroom into a circus." Mary smirked slightly. "Are you sure you're still the one in charge here, Edward?" He shot her a stern look, but didn't respond. Deep down, he knew Jasmine Crockett had already changed the rules of the game. Meanwhile, in Jasmine's modest East Dallas office, things were buzzing with activity. The small room was filled with boxes of documents, the walls covered with newspaper clippings and children's drawings gifted by locals. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with a hint of dust from the old carpets. Her assistant, 30-year-old Devin, sat at a laptop, typing furiously. "Are you sure you want to take this all the way?" he asked, eyes still on the screen. "Greenlee's not the type to give in easily. My uncle says he once sentenced a guy to a month for spitting on the sidewalk." Jasmine, seated at her desk with a pen in hand, looked up. "Devin, I don't look for easy paths. This case isn't about a fine. It's about what happens when power forgets who it's supposed to serve. If I back down, what will people in East Dallas think? That their voice doesn't matter?" Devin nodded, though doubt flickered in his eyes. "It's just. Greenlee's old as the law itself. He could bury this appeal in red tape." "Let him try," Jasmine replied with a faint smile. "I know men like him. He thinks I'm just a loud politician. But I'm not just talk, I act." She set the pen down and walked to the window. Outside were old brick buildings, some cracked, but proud. Kids kicked a ball on the sidewalk, and an elderly woman in a robe watered flowers on her porch. This was her neighborhood, imperfect, but alive, and she wouldn't let it be crushed by indifference or prejudice. The appeal hearing was set for the following week. This time, the courtroom was full. Reporters from local stations, activists holding signs reading justice for East Dallas, a few retirees in faded blazers who had come to support Jasmine. The murmur of voices blended with the creaking of wooden benches as people took their seats. Greenlee entered with a stern expression, his robe rustling like dry leaves. "Quiet," he barked, banging his gavel. "We are now in session." Prosecutor Baines spoke first, his voice sharp and slightly anxious. "Your Honor, the defendant's appeal is a distraction from the facts. She disobeyed a police order, and the fine was appropriate. We ask that her motion be denied." Greenlee nodded, but his gaze landed on Jasmine. She rose, holding only a thin folder, no stacks of paper, no theatrics. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm, but resonating in every corner of the room. "I do not deny that I stood before a crowd on March 15th. But I do deny that this constituted disorderly conduct. The First Amendment guarantees me the right to speak out, especially in defense of my community. In Cox v. Louisiana, the Supreme Court ruled that peaceful protest cannot be silenced simply because it inconveniences the authorities. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't blocking traffic. I was speaking. And if that's a crime, then we're all in danger." Greenlee felt a tightness in his chest. Her argument was strong, too strong. He looked over at Baines, who was fumbling through his notes, clearly unprepared. "Ms. Crockett," Greenlee interrupted, "are you claiming that the police overstepped their authority?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied without hesitation. "They didn't give me a chance to explain. They saw a crowd, saw me, a black woman speaking for a poor neighborhood, and decided I was a threat. That's not law. That's bias." The room stirred. Reporters whispered, activists nodded. Greenlee felt sweat forming at his temples. He knew she was playing on emotion, but her words carried weight. And then came the twist. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked an elderly woman, thin, gray braid, simple dress. Her name was Esther Moore, 72, a resident of East Dallas. Her hands trembled as she held a sheet of paper and asked to speak. Though surprised, Greenlee allowed it. "Your Honor," Esther began, her voice shaking but resolute, "I was at that protest. Jasmine wasn't causing trouble. She helped me when I fell, the crowd pushed me, and I could have broken my hip. She pulled me aside, gave me water. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't be standing here. And the center she's talking about. It saved me after my husband died. That's where I got free medicine, where I didn't feel alone." Greenlee froze. Esther wasn't on the witness list. Her appearance was a surprise, and it flipped everything upside down. He looked at Jasmine. She stood still, but a spark lit her eyes. Did she know Esther would come? Or was it just luck? Either way, it changed the atmosphere in the room. Baines tried to object. Your Honor, this has no relevance to the case. It does, Greenlee snapped. If the defendant acted in service of the community, it casts doubt on the charges. He leaned back in his chair, pulse quickening. Jasmine Crockett didn't just know the law, she knew people. And that made her dangerous. But what truly shook him was that he, an old judge who had seen it all, suddenly began to doubt his own ruling. The courtroom fell silent after Esther Moore's words. Her trembling voice still echoed in Judge Greenlee's ears as she slowly returned to her seat, supported by the young activist with short hair. Outside, Dallas exhaled its hot breath. The distant honk of a truck mingled with the rustling of leaves swaying in the wind. Inside, however, the air had become heavy, like it was about to rain. Greenlee felt his palms grow sweaty as he glanced at Jasmine Crockett. She stood motionless, her gaze calm, yet there was a strength in it that he hadn't noticed before. Prosecutor Baines stood up, his face reddening with irritation. Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation. Ms. Moore's testimony wasn't disclosed in advance. We ask that it be dismissed. Greenlee raised his hand, stopping him. Sit down, Mr. Baines. I decide what matters here. He turned his gaze to Jasmine. Miss Crockett, did you know Ms. Moore would testify? She shook her head slightly. No, Your Honor. But I'm glad she's here. Her voice is what I stood for at that protest. Not mine, but hers. Greenlee felt something stir in his chest. He ran a hand through his gray hair, trying to collect his thoughts. His whole life, he had adhered to the letter of the law, clear rules that kept chaos at bay. But now before him stood a woman who not only knew the law, but also knew how to show where it failed. And Esther Moore, with her hunched back and trembling hands, was living proof of that. I want to hear more, he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. Ms. Moore, please step forward again. Esther slowly rose, her eyes sparkling with tears, but she held herself with dignity. She spoke, and this time her voice was stronger. I'm not a lawyer, Your Honor. I'm just a widow living on a pension. But that center, it was my home. There, I learned how to use a computer to write letters to my grandchildren. They helped me sort through medical bills when I couldn't pay them. And when it closed, no one asked us, the elderly, how we would manage. Jasmine was the only one who came and listened. She didn't yell, she didn't fight. She simply said, we can change this together. Greenlee felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered his sister Ellen, who lived in Austin and often complained that her pension barely covered her medications. He had always brushed it off, saying, these are tough times. But now those words seemed empty. Jasmine stepped forward. Your Honor, I'm not asking for the fine to be dismissed for my sake. I'm asking you to look at what's behind this case. The law is meant to protect people like Esther, not punish those who try to help them. If I broke an order, it was only because silence would have been a greater crime. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters frantically took notes. Activists clenched their fists in quiet support. Greenlee felt his heart race. He knew he could dismiss the appeal. He had grounds. But could he sleep at night knowing he ignored the truth? He struck the gavel, calling for silence. I'm taking a 30-minute break. I need to think. In his small room, behind the courtroom, Greenlee sat at his desk, holding a cold cup of coffee. The smell of old wood and dust calmed him, but his thoughts buzzed like a swarm of bees. He flipped through Jasmine's appeal, her clear arguments about freedom of speech and community rights. Then he thought of Esther, her wrinkled face, her voice trembling but unyielding. And suddenly he understood. This wasn't just a case. This was the moment when he had to decide who he was, a blind servant of the law or someone who could improve it. When he returned to the courtroom, all eyes were on him. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and spoke. "I have reviewed Ms. Crockett's appeal and Ms. Moore's testimony. The law is clear. Violating a police order is a violation. But the law also gives me the right to consider the circumstances. I am overturning the $250 fine. Moreover, I recommend that the district prosecutor review the case regarding the closure of the community center in East Dallas. If there are violations of citizens' rights, they must be investigated." The courtroom erupted in applause. Esther pressed her hands to her chest, her eyes shining. Jasmine nodded at Greenlee, not triumphantly, but respectfully. Baines looked as though he had been struck, but said nothing. Greenlee stood, his robes rustling, and added, "Ms. Crockett, you reminded me that the court is not just about rules, but about people. I don't often admit it, but today you've won. The case is closed." He struck the gavel, and the crowd's noise drowned everything out. Jasmine turned to Esther, embraced her, and the activists began chanting her name. But Greenlee saw in her eyes not just victory. There was hope, a hope that this was only the beginning. That evening, Greenlee sat in his office, looking at the sunset over Dallas. The sky was ablaze with red and gold, reflecting off the windows of the skyscrapers. He turned on the old radio on his desk. A quiet Frank Sinatra tune, "My Way," played. For the first time in many years, he felt lightness in his chest. He called his sister Ellen. "Ellen, remember you were complaining about the library closure in your neighborhood?" he said when she picked up the phone. "Yes, what about it?" Her voice was surprised. "Tell me more. Maybe I can help." On the other side of the city, Jasmine stood on the porch of Esther's house, holding a glass of iced tea. Children were playing soccer in the street, and the warm breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the garden. Esther sat in the rocking chair, smiling. "Do you think they'll reopen the center?" she asked. Jasmine looked at the horizon where the last rays of the sun were fading. "I don't know, Esther. But we showed that we can fight. And that's already something." She raised her glass, as if in a quiet toast, and felt warmth spread through her chest. The sky darkened, but the stars began to shine, small, but bright, like a promise of tomorrow.